Hello everyone, and welcome back to the production stream of Don't Give Up, a deep house track that I've been working on. If you're just joining me for the first time, this is a continuation of the development of a deep house track completely from scratch, starting with just some bass lines that I put together, all the way through to full arrangements and the track that you're hearing in the background now. Looking forward today going through a couple of things with us just to catch everybody up and bring you into the final process. So the process I use for writing my tracks kind of follows along broadly the following sort of path. I usually do a bunch of ideation or just thinking about what my track might sound like, or just working with various sound design elements or working with various musical theme elements, writing cool bass lines or writing cool drum patterns and trying to take those and find a good vocal chop that might sit, or find some cool instrument to sit on top that I think would make a pretty good mix of instruments to then try to bring a whole track around. I then will lay out various pieces and parts, like I'll write some bass lines and then maybe some rhythm sections, then bring in some drums and kind of fit the drums in and around those to get a basic groove down. Once I've got that basic groove down, then I'm going to think about things like, okay, what's the sound that should sit on top? What should I have as a lead instrument? Then I go through a process of arranging it into a track, and so for example, you can see here in my MIDI track, I've got a MIDI track on top that's really just there for titles to give me some idea of the sections of where I'm going to build the track. Then I work on transitions between these sections. One of the things that musically matters a lot is flow of a song, and that extends from every player, every instrument that you've got in that track. So I work real hard at making sure that each of the parts has a flow to it that is logical and makes sense, and I kind of almost think about, if I was playing that particular part live, how would I make that sound? How would that go together with the other parts, etc. Then I kind of will think about, okay, what's the melodic content? What do I want to really be memorable for the listeners? What's the part that when they leave, I want them really kind of, humming? Is it the bass line, which, is often the case in a deep house track, the bass line really rides real high? Or is it the melody, right? Because sometimes you even make those go together. In this track, I've got some elements that work together like that. You can hear the melody and the bass kind of will definitely go together and have some timing sections that are very similar to each other. But overall, I did make this one so that there's a little bit of variety in between those two. After I'm done with that, I usually then look at making little sound sections that kind of come together to tie all the elements together. So I'll make little turnarounds or make sections of the instrumentation that are almost as if someone was playing and that everybody played the same thing coming into a swell, for example. Then I go about mixing, and in today's day and age, it's you don't really, when you're building a track from scratch this way, you don't, at least I find that I'm often mixing while I'm actually composing and working on the individual tracks. So by the time you get to the final mix stage, there are often times that I will actually take a whole section and just break down all the different elements and then remix it from scratch, take all faders to zero and bring it up. But sometimes it kind of feels about right, where it was. And in this particular case, I didn't do all that much extra mixing to try to get this to a point where I think it feels pretty good. So once I'm done with the mixing, then I worry about things like overall space, dropping reverb on the entire track, bringing a reverb in for just certain elements. And I'm going to go through that in a minute of something I did on this track in particular. And then, of course, I go through some thoughts about mastering. Now, each of these items, there are specialists out there in the world who do nothing but this. And, it's kind of funny in today's day and age that we do it all together in one element. But I sort of think, okay, if I were a mastering engineer, how would I approach this track, and what's the overall contour of the sound that I'd like it to have? And with some of the tools you have today, some of that's a lot easier than it used to be in terms of trying to get it done. I'm sure there are I'm sure there are mastering artists out there that could do a better job than my own self-masters, but I like the idea of trying to put out my own stuff and have it, more or less close to production ready anyway at reasonable gain levels and at reasonable sound contour and tone. So today I'm just going to go through a couple of those elements for the track, and then we'll do a playthrough of the whole track near the end. So one of the things that I did in the off stream, and for those that have been playing, watching along with this, the vocals were taken from a sample pack from a sample that I got off of Splice. I've been using Splice for quite some time now. It's actually, I think, a really nice place to go get really interesting samples. And the core sample, let's see if I can find the original. I probably have it in here. Original sample was a relatively long sample with several elements that are all kind of soulful vocals, from very thin to some gang vocals to some harmonies to just elements, right? So I took some chops from here. It's actually kind of a pretty cool sample. I may even come back in this one and grab sections of it again for another time, but for another track. But I took chops of that. I turned those chops into some very specific sections so that I could develop my own melody off of it and my own sort of flow of the logic. And this track is all about, not giving up and understanding that no matter how bad things are today, things will always be better tomorrow, that the sun will come out another day. And I think it's kind of a nice uplifting message. Of course, it was pretty interesting that the vocal sample that I chose was in minor, which is traditionally sort of melancholy, if you will. But one of the things I struggled with on this in particular was that the vocal was from a very, very different tempo than what I'm writing at. So I'm writing at 124 here, but this vocal was taken from, I think, somewhere around 76 or 78 or something like that. So when I took this up, I got some artifacting in the warping algorithms. Now, Ableton is fantastic. I love Ableton's warping. It's so easy to use and easy to understand. Well, I actually take that back. It takes a while to actually understand it, but once you do understand it, you can really get some amazing results. But because I had taken this from such a dramatically different tempo, there were still some artifacts in there. So I spent quite a bit of time going through the individual clips and automating pieces and parts of them so that I got the overall sound I was looking for. I brought in some processing on the tracks in particular, where I brought in a little bit of compression. I threw a chorus on some of them, not all that much, but enough. And what that can actually do sometimes is that can help just give a little bit of movement to the core vocal, which then helps overshadow the things like artifacts that you've got. And in this particular case, the chorus did a pretty good job of that. I also I brought in a chorus that actually was just working on pitch, and I just wobbled the pitch just a little bit on some of the vocals, just so that it again helped cover up or overshadow some of the algorithm problems that were developed from the overall warping. Now these sit on the master channel for the main Vox, and then I think I did the same thing on the chops Vox. So I ran two different sort of main lines of vocals here, both the main elements that were the sort of the core, the don't give ups, and then these are the chops that sat down below. Let me bring those in. Just the small blibs and blobs. And I run one channel that's wide, so this is the elements that'll sit out wide in the stereo spectrum, and this is the more up the center. And you can still hear there are still elements of the warping even in these, which I worked pretty hard to try to get those tuned out. And I think I may have, no, I don't have any particular processing on the channels themselves, other than the stereo field. But again, I did some work here with the choruses to try to get them to where they weren't so obvious. Then I think on the main, I also brought in just a little touch of saturation, both from the saturator and the dynamic tube. Again, just to bring in some slightly different distortion that can, again, sort of help make it sound more cohesive and get rid of some of those warping artifacts. But again, they ended up sounding pretty good, and I got them to sit in the mix pretty well. And once it's up in the mix and you got the full track playing, it did a pretty nice job. If you really know what you're listening for, you can still hear some minor problems, but I think it did a pretty good job of getting it to an overall level where I was pretty happy with those vocals. So then I went about the process of mixing, and I did the mix down, all live here in the session view, and I thought about each little element, how they all fit together. And one of the very first things that I really worked hard on was getting the bass and the kick to sit well. Push it forward a little bit. And one of the funny things about this track was I really liked the bass, and I wanted this bass to ride pretty high. So one of the sacrifices I made on that was to cut a little bit of the low end out of the kick drum, so that the kick drum and the bass really weren't conflicting too much. And when I get near the end of this, I'll show you a really cool tool that I've been using for a while to help work with both those issues. But what I'll do is I'll get the kick and bass, and then I'll try to bring in the drum elements. So once I feel pretty good about where these two are sitting, then I'll go up here, bring in the drums. And in deep house, you want the drums to sit pretty nice, but you don't want them to be too overriding up in the high end and the cymbals, right? This is, I think, more driven by the groove. Now the drum obviously is a big portion of that groove, but I don't want the drums just overbearing. So I think I've got them sitting pretty nice. Now I bring in the rhythmic elements. And here, there was a fair amount of automation that went into the rhythm sections. Pretty much on all different sections. So, sorry, let's go here. So on pretty much every one of these rhythmic elements, there was a fair amount of automation that I was bringing in, ranging from changing styles on the ARP to changing where the frequencies were on filters, even to playing with unison and detune up here on the pad track, so it got a little wider and a little more full in some areas. So there's a fair amount of work that went into that to trying to get those to sit right. And of course, during the mix down process, I also worked with volume on some of these sections to make sure that elements that were riding high had some volume changes to it. Again, thinking like, okay, if I was really a piano player leaning into that turnaround, what would I be doing? And I'd be probably bringing that volume up so you actually heard those chords stand out as you came into the turnaround. Once I finished, sort of the individual elements like that, I turned my attention to the overall and worked on, grouping these all up and saying, okay, where does the entire section sit? And then brought in the leads and the Vox on top of that, so that I could then make sure that those sat in the mix well enough that you could hear them and that they were clear. And that they were distinct enough in the track that they're the parts you'd remember, right? This is hopefully the memorable part of the track. Once I got that done, I worked a little bit on things like overall reverb or specific reverb. You got sections of the individual rhythm pieces where I was changing where that was going, worried about some delay effects and the rest. Every now and again, I'm actually automating some of those elements as well. So you'll see that there's a little bit of automation there on some of the overall sound as well. Where's our food? Okay. Okay, sorry about that. I had to take a quick break for a moment and just deal with something here in the house. All right, so where I was here in the overview was that once I've got the various elements, I think, sitting well together in the mix, then I start thinking about things like the old Shimmer Reverb, which is something I did, in fact, add on this track because I think it added just a little bit of a nice touch on the top end. Now, my template for my routing kind of works like this. You can see the individual tracks over here from all the sections. And these, the drums through, whatever instruments you have, all come into the pre-master dry. And the pre-master dry has a compressor on it, which is then side-chained to the kick. Now, the kick will come into the pre-master dry kick. And the reason I do that is for the obvious reason of side-chaining the whole thing to the kick in case I want that. Now, I usually go very light on this. You can see it's actually only at about 43% because the elements where this is super important, like the bass, etc., those are all going to be side-chained directly. But occasionally you want a little bit of pumping in the whole track as well. Obviously, that changes by genre. If this is going to be a heavy dance track, this might be a very, very heavy sidechain here. 1,000 apologies for my four-legged alarm system there. It scared the hell out of everybody out there. Certainly did me. So sorry about that. All right, so again, depending on the genre, you may pump this compressor up a little bit to where it makes the whole track have some breath to it. But the other advantage of having a pre-master dry come in like this is that then I can put also effects across the entire track. Now, I didn't do too much here. I didn't actually send this out to the main reverb because I did most of my individual elements all head into the main reverb as it was. But I did create a shimmer reverb on this one. Which I think is kind of an older mixing trick, but I've always kind of liked it just to lift a little bit of the high end. It almost makes the high end feel like it's a little taller, right, in the mix, which is kind of a funny way to think about it. But I take the entire pre-master dry without the kick, and I send that off to this reverb. And what this reverb has got on it is literally just a very high reverb that is filtered. So all it's doing is just the very, very top of everything. And it's just extending the really high ranges just a smidge over everything else. You can see it's actually relatively short. It's not even a second long in terms of what that reverb is. It's subtle, but what it does is, in my opinion, it just kind of, in many cases, it just adds a slightly longer decay on some of the super high-end stuff, which makes it feel a little smoother, I think, at the very top end. So if you listen here, I'll turn it off to start with. Now, I certainly don't think the top end sounds bad in this track at all, but if I turn this on, it's super subtle. But when you're in really nice headphones and you're A/Bing, you can kind of hear the top end just kind of, it almost rounds off just a little bit. And again, all this is doing is just a super high end like that. So I'll do a little bit of work there, not a lot. I don't like to futz with the too many effects on the overall track. And I try to keep side chaining and all that relatively light. But I felt pretty good about where this mix was sitting based on where I had mixed it coming along into sort of these final stages. And then I have Ozone 8, which I have never upgraded past Ozone 8. I've always been pretty happy with Ozone 8, which I use as my mastering tool. And I've got a relatively straightforward master, some light. I just pulled some stuff down at the bottom end. I usually nick out a little bit around 400, kind of get rid of a little woody feel. That's not even all that much. I think it's 2 decibels. I felt like that I needed a little bit of lift up here in the mid and maybe on the top end. I do generally, use the compressors as well, just to make sure that things stay kind of dynamically together. I didn't use a whole lot of the exciter, just a little bit, and it's just here in these mid sections. I could turn off the top and bottom. I guess I'm using the top a little bit as well. And then the imager, I've got very little. Actually, I'm not even really using much on the imager, so we might do a little bit of work on there. I think, frankly, I hadn't even gotten to that yet. And then, a little bit of some limiting here, just to, using the maximizer, if you will, just to compress it up a little bit and get it closer to commercial levels. There's the whole loudness war, etc. I tend to come in between -8 and -10 RMS. I usually listen to my ears. I usually listen to how I think the track sounds and do some bypassing with the gain match on, just to take a look at it. So I'm probably gonna do some of the imager work right here, right now, and then come into how I actually check the reference on the final master for the next stages. So why don't you stay tuned with me here? I'll do a little bit of work with imager just to spread out the top end of the track a little bit, and then we'll move into the final stages before I do a print. So here we go. So all I'm really doing with the imager is I usually lift the very top and the mids. I will bring the lows down and pull those down in support of making the very low end mono. often find that the imager just kind of brings out some of the elements just a little bit out in the side. So I'm not going to do a whole lot with that. In fact, I'll probably bring that down just a little bit. I think that feels pretty good right there, and I'm a habitual A-B'er. So I'll do this a lot just to see if I'm really doing something to the mix. Hey, is that you, Spidey? Hey, how are you? So I'm streaming live on YouTube as well as here in Discord. So thanks for joining me in the Discord. Thank you. So we're getting real close on finishing this track up. So, all right. So once I'm here at the imager, then I'm gonna run the maximizer as well. And I try not to have this beat down too hard. You can see I'm really only having it grab maybe 3-4 decibels, somewhere in that range. But what this does is bring it up to commercial loudness. Again, I'm shooting for at most -8, somewhere about down to -11 or so is I think where you can get away with it. Most systems now, Spotify, etc., are all bringing things up to certain levels anyway, so you don't have to fuss with that as much as you used to have to think about it, I think, over the last couple of years. Now, once I'm here, there's two things I will then do specifically. I'll work with tonal balance control, which I really like this edition, which is part of Ozone 8. And, I've got it on bass heavy because, of course, it's a deep house track. But you can see that broadly I'm in the contours here of, these ranges. Now, nothing's perfect, and even if you look at the broad ranges, I'm in pretty good shape. Maybe a little high on the top end, but not too much that I would worry about that. So I feel pretty good about that. Now, I also will use Insight. And what I've done on the Insight is the following. I've mapped meters on specific tracks out there. So when you're looking at this graph, let me just freeze this for a second. So when you're looking at this graph, what you're seeing is the yellow section here is really the high end of the drums. So this will be my snare, my cymbals, all that kind of stuff. This purple is the kick drum. The blue is the bass. The red is all the rhythm instruments. The green is the lead, and the Vox is going to be the orange. Now, I set that up with individual meter taps out here on the sections because I have a whole little section of tracks out here that get their feeds from those various different sections. And on each of those, I've got an isotope meter tap. That meter tap then feeds back into the spectrogram, and it gives me very fine control to look at the various elements. So here, for example, you can see there's a very sustained bass on the low end, but the kick is poking through nicely on the low end as well as up here in the mid-range. So that kick is going to be, audible, and you can definitely hear that in the track. Now, if I come back into a busier section, you can see here, I'll do a little bit of analysis, especially on this low end where it's hard to hear because not many people have speakers that, they go down to 30, 40 hertz. And I've got good monitors in my studio, but I did almost this entire track not in my studio. So I will use this as a visual comparison just to make sure that my very, very low end is not massively conflicting with each other, because you can get a lot of wasted energy down here. But again, I'll sort of take a look at this and say, okay, well, does this image make sense for what I want people to hear? So do I want this rhythm to stand out down here in this section? Yes. Do I want the melody to stand out up here? Yes. And, like I said, I've already done a fair bit of mixing on this track, so I feel pretty good about where most of this sits. And this is such a great little tool. Now, also you've got a polar view here as well. And of course, what you don't want is you don't want that stuff hovering down here at 0, because then you'll end up with some potential mono problems, which I will then also play with this. Now, this is the tool that I mentioned a moment ago, Clavia Mix Monitor. What I love about this is they built a very simple tool that just allows you to listen to various sections of your mix. Now, you can hear the sub. And you can kind of hear that, but that's actually fairly clean between that bass and that kick drum. I spent a little bit of work trying to make sure that that got cleaned up. There's still a little bit of conflict, a little bit of muddiness there, but you also got to get a track done. So at the end of the day, you got to sometimes live with a little bit of imperfection. This is the slightly higher bass section, so you can hear this. And again, you're going to try to go to a busy section. And that sounds pretty clean. You can hear the different elements pretty nicely. Bring in the mids. I always think this sounds funny because it sounds like you're listening to it on your phone. Bring in the high mids. I think those elements are living quite nicely together. And then the super highs, which are, I'm listening for phasiness or any kind of weirdness up in that range. The washy sound of MP3s, for example, which, one of the cool things about Ozone 8 is that you can make it do the codec right live, which is pretty cool. But overall, I think each of those sections sound pretty good. So then I will also listen to it in mono to make sure that it's mono compatible. That sounds pretty decent in mono. You can hear all the elements pretty well. I mean, maybe that bass is a little bit loud in mono, but the pieces don't sound disconnected. They sound pretty together, so that's good. And then occasionally I'll just give a listen to the sides as well. Probably a little bit more bass information out there in the sides than I would have expected, but not so much that I'd worry about that. If that was really heavy, I might go out there and do a mid-side EQ just to take some of that out. But I feel pretty good overall about where that mix sits, especially when I throw the Ozone on it. I feel pretty good about that overall. So, now that I feel pretty good about the general mix, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to run a couple prints of it, and I will go ahead and print them down to MP3. Take them out, listen to them in some other environments, listen to them on some other people's systems, send them to some friends, get some reactions, see if there's something that I missed. And then I think I'm probably within 2 or 3 days of printing this. So if you're here with me live, thank you very much. I appreciate that. It's great to have you here with me. If you're catching this on a view afterwards on YouTube, thanks for the view. Certainly would appreciate any and all thoughts as you listen to this. And pretty soon I'll just have a little video out there that's got the track, and I appreciate everyone who's come along with me. Thanks a lot. Hope you